here we are, back to our mission. So embedded in our mission are some key principles I want to talk about just to start out that will also give you a preview of our methodology. So the way we will organize this talk today is that we'll have each presenter, myself, and then Helen, and then Laura, speak for 15 minutes. And I'll speak about kind of an overview of our mission and methods at Global Rights for Women. Helen will tell you then about the law, the international law, regional law, and policy and standards that give us really a common language for our work, certainly with international partners and across borders. And then Laura will illuminate all of what Helen and I have said through some really concrete examples of both our past work and the work that we're doing now. And then we've left, like I say, half an hour for questions. So that's how we'll organize this presentation today. So embedded, as I said, in this mission are key principles that really are fundamental to our values at Global Rights for Women and our work. And the reason we are so, as you can see, laser focused on violence against women is because violence against women and girls, gender-based violence, is a pandemic around the world. During COVID, they called it a pandemic within a pandemic. It's been there for centuries. It affects half the population and is among the most widespread, if not the most widespread and deeply institutionalized human rights abuse of our time and throughout history. And laws, we believe at Global Rights for Women, laws and systems, and laws being the bedrock of all that, are an essential part of ending that violence. We believe that the rule of law, that people have a right to have access to the rule of law, and that people have a right to be free from violence that is enforced through laws. So while we can articulate at the United Nations and other institutions principles of human rights, it's the law in the local and state and national and international realm that actually serves to enforce those human rights. The cross-border collaboration featured there in our mission is we do that through a sharing of experience and expertise that we feel strengthens the overall global movement to end gender-based violence, which that movement has just grown exponentially in the time I've been doing this work over the last 3 decades. So we're going to dig into these highlights just a bit. With a quote from Rashida Manjoo, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on violence against women previous to Dubravka Simonovic, who is there now and just ending her term. These special rapporteurs are a component of the number of ways that the United Nations addresses violence against women, and Helen will talk about that a little later. But leaders like Rashida Manjoo at the highest levels of the United Nations and regional bodies, such as the Council of Europe, the African Union, the Organization of American States, have been loud and clear, particularly in recent years, on the catastrophic levels of global violence against women and girls, calling it a pandemic, one has said, the greatest human rights issue of our time, another has said. So these leaders are calling out also very clearly and strongly government's failure to effectively address gender-based violence. Lack of accountability, as Ms. Manjoo says, is the rule rather than the exception around the world. So these kinds of statements have been followed by increased activity, new regional treaties, new programs such as the European Spotlight Campaign and the Essential Services Program from UN Women that Laura will tell you a little bit more about as we go forward. The types of violence I'm going to go to the sobering statistics are just again really provide some of the just grounding for our intense focus on gender-based violence. Part of the activity at the global level has been to gather more and more data, including these statistics that you see here. And this has really increased also over particularly the recent last 10 years, maybe 15, that more and more organizations everywhere are gathering statistics about the nature of this human rights abuse. The World Health Organization, that statistic is there first. That's from 2013, affects 30 intimate partner violence, the most common form of violence, affects 30% of women worldwide. And the second statistic there is more recent from 2018. The United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime did a major report that was focused some on femicide and revealed this really jaw-dropping statistic that we know, I'm sure, is not the totality of the numbers. The types of violence around the world are listed on the next slide there. Most of these forms are common everywhere. Child marriage, for example, and female genital mutilation are thought of as a problem in developing countries, but have been exposed in developed countries more and more in recent years. We tend to think that that's a problem somewhere else. But we know as more and more groups are focusing and revealing the reality of these issues, that these forms of violence are everywhere. The newest regional treaty, the Istanbul Convention, covers all these forms of violence, interestingly enough. So that's an international law. It's a regional law, but there's about 40 countries in the Council of Europe, and it covers all these forms of violence, recognizing their linkages and their common roots, really importantly, their common roots, which is inequality, subjugation, and unequal power between men and women. The roots of violence here, at Global Rights for Women, we address gender-based violence with the belief that institutional misogyny and subjugation are at their core. And both our mission and our methodology target these roots of gender-based violence. They're recognized at both the local level, where Global Rights for Women is headquartered by the Power and Control Wheel, which I'll show you in a minute, and by the United Nations. So first, let's take a look at the United Nations first comprehensive statement on violence against women, and that is the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which was passed by the General Assembly, adopted by the General Assembly in 1993. And this is a really important statement that the United Nations said back then. This was really the first official statement of in-depth analysis of just the nature of the problem and the root causes. That in 1993, the United Nations used this statement to call on governments to increase their efforts to address violence against women and girls. At that time, very few countries had effective laws or any laws at all on the most common forms of violence that occur in the private sphere: domestic violence and sexual assault. So DEVA, we call it, Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and the other regional instruments and laws are what, as I said before, and Helen will discuss, have become our common language across borders. And then locally, the Power and Control Wheel. Interestingly enough, this Power and Control Wheel, many of you may have seen it. I know it's hard to read here, but it's consistent with that statement by the United Nations General Assembly. This was developed in Duluth, Minnesota, well over 10 years before DEVA was adopted, and reflects exactly that theory of violence. And it's important because from a theory of violence grows law, policy, and practice in every community and jurisdiction everywhere. For example, as we've seen in many countries that we work in at Global Rights for Women, if your theory of violence is different than that inequality and that power imbalance, for example, if you believe it stems from relationship problems, you will develop, as you move forward, entirely different interventions. And this power and control wheel, while recognizing the physical and sexual violence that punctuates all the other forms of coercion and control and psychological violence, all stems from this, this goal, this desire to maintain power and control in intimate partner relationships, mostly against women. So I will just move quickly to talk a little bit about our methods, and those will be, like I say, talked about in more detail by Laura, who will use specific examples of our past and present work. These 4 bullet points just give an overview of how Global Rights for Women works. When we're working internationally, actually locally too, but even more so importantly, internationally, we always join with a local partner. Currently, our partners are, and we're responding to outreach from our partners at the United Nations to a great extent. United Nations has, UN Women is the main office, the main kind of central home office in New York, but UN Women also has regional offices all over the world and some country offices. We also work with NGOs. We actually prefer to have our local partner be an NGO who's front and center in any effort and whose mission, like GRW's, prioritizes systemic and legal change. We never find it necessary to search for, or rare circumstances, I should say, for search for partners. So many leaders around the world, women's human rights leaders around the world, are working on new laws, new systemic reforms, and the enforcement of laws. And they're interested in the expertise and experience of Global Rights for Women because of our longstanding work. Our staff has long-standing experience and expertise, and our consultants also do. Working not only at home in their own realm, in their own jurisdictions, in their own localities, but also being familiar with what it takes to work in a jurisdiction in another country where intervention, systemic and institutional intervention on violence against women is relatively new. We of course agree on a project focus of primary importance, and what directs most of our work, all of our work, is the gaps that have been identified by local partners, where the country is in its progress, and our approach is to meet them where we are with our experience and expertise. And many of you may know that the first laws on domestic violence in the world were in the US and some parts of Europe and Australia and New Zealand. So those were in the 1970s and 80s. So there is a lot of expertise that our global partners can draw on. We identify funding at various points in our processes. Sometimes the funding is available through the United Nations through a specific project that their local partners have identified. Sometimes we, along with our NGO partners, for example, right now in Armenia, our NGO partner is looking to build the capacity of probation officers to supervise domestic violence offenders. And we need to look then, we know that's important. We worked in Armenia since our inception in 2014. We know that's important and are looking for funding for that together. So that's common too. Our work, the nature of our work is research, consultation, trainings. Those are our primary work products, and we'll give you some concrete examples of those as we go forward. So I have just a couple more minutes left before I turn it over to Helen, and a lot more slides. So, well, not a lot more slides, but I just want to say something about the advantages of global partnerships in these next slides. So our experience has been that global partnerships, as I said before, they strengthen, they build, they have a ripple effect in the movement to end violence against women. The partnerships endure, particularly our partnerships with local NGOs, because of the commonality of our experience of violence against women and girls. That has been such an interesting component of our work is to see that our partners around the world, so much more we have in common when we are working with victims of violence than is different. Certainly there are differences from culture to culture, but so much of what victims experience is common across borders. I'm going to just take one more minute on the next slide here. The advantages of local partners. This is a brilliant author who talks about this in her book, and she outlines further on the next slide those advantages. The simple fact of our experience, as I mentioned before, is a powerful force for our local partners. For example, in Southeast Asia, some of these countries that we're working with right now, some have laws. Most of the laws that are in the books are not enforced. It's useful to have an international partner with decades of experience. For example, police, we often bring police, prosecutors, judges who have been working with these issues and on these cases for many years, and they can bring power and additional power to the local partner's voice and also connect with their counterparts in other countries. A great example of that is the prosecutor curriculum training that we have just finished for Southeast Asia. There's very little prosecution of violence against women crimes in the region, and we were privileged to work with the United Nations to develop, along with prosecutors here and partners in the region, an entire curriculum, train-the-trainer curriculum for prosecutors in the region. So I will end with that slide and go on to Helen, who will dig a little deeper into our common language, the international and regional law and standards on gender-based violence. Go ahead, Helen.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm going to talk about the international legal framework. This framework is important to our work because, as Cheryl said, it offers us a common language, a common structure, and it creates standards for governments to follow in addressing violence against women and girls. And some of these frameworks are binding, some are not. And the international law should provide recourse to advocates and survivors when their own governments don't take appropriate action to protect women from violence. Some legal mechanisms are stronger, some are weaker, but even within the stronger ones, there are important gaps. And I'll talk about both the strengths and the weaknesses of these frameworks and how Global Rights for Women uses them in our work and what we and others are doing to try to strengthen the international framework. As this slide shows, one of the weaknesses is that although the United Nations has 10 core human rights instruments, none of them include binding language that applies directly to violence against women and girls. And that's kind of the overarching problem that we face in working with international law. So these are some of the UN treaties that address violence against women and girls to some extent. And of course, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, is the only international legally binding treaty that focuses on women's human rights. But some of these other treaties that are listed here also directly address violence against women, but as a subgroup of a broader focus. And I'll just take a second to talk about the last one on the list, which is the International Labor Organization's Convention on Harassment in the World of Work. This is a new treaty. It was adopted in 2019. And It addresses the important issue of physical, psychological, sexual, and economic harm in the world of work. And it will actually enter into force on this Friday, on June 25th. So I'll say a little bit more about CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. CEDAW has been in effect for 40 years, yet, as Cheryl pointed out, violence against women and girls continues to be one of, if not the most widespread human rights violation in the world. CEDAW is a very important achievement, but it's inadequate for a number of reasons. One of those is that it doesn't even include the word violence or rape or assault in the treaty itself. At the time that CEDAW was adopted, violence against women was considered to be a private matter. And the recognition of violence against women as a human rights issue only came gradually after CEDAW was adopted. The other major weakness of CEDAW is that it's simply too broad to focus adequately on the issue of violence against women and girls. The CEDAW committee, which is the enforcement mechanism for CEDAW, has to deal with all forms of discrimination against women, just as the name of the treaty says. And so they're unable to devote sufficient attention to violence. Now, the CEDAW committee has made efforts to retrofit the concept of violence into the treaty, and this has primarily been through General Recommendations 19 and 35. And General Recommendation 35 has some especially strong language. But the problem is that recommendations are only recommendations. They're not binding. They don't have to be ratified by the members of the treaty. And so countries that want to can choose to ignore them. There are a couple of ways that advocates and survivors can access the CEDAW process. One of those is through the optional protocol. This was adopted in 1999, and it created a complaint and inquiry procedure so that individuals and groups can bring complaints of violations of the convention to the CEDAW committee, and also the committee can initiate its own investigations. And unlike the general recommendations, the optional protocol is binding because the countries had to ratify it to be subject to its jurisdiction. Again, as with CEDAW generally, the problem is that the optional protocol is, the scope is too broad, resources are too limited to give adequate attention to violence against women. In over 20 years since the optional protocol came into effect, the committee has issued only 29 decisions involving violence against women, and the vast majority of those have involved only Western countries. And in fact, the committee of the Convention Against Torture has actually considered more complaints on violence against women than the CEDAW committee has. Periodic reporting is another opportunity for input. Every country that's a party to CEDAW is required to submit a report about their compliance with the treaty every 4 years. And over the years, there has been an increasing focus on violence. But because most countries only highlight the progress and the positive things that they're doing, there's also an opportunity for other individuals and groups to submit what are called shadow reports. And these shadow reports are generally more objective and give a better picture of the situation with regard to violence against women and other issues. So with that, let's look at the non-binding international legal mechanisms. There are a number of very strong non-binding mechanisms, and they carry great persuasive and moral authority. But because these instruments don't require ratification, there is no enforcement mechanism and no requirement that that countries comply with them. Cheryl already talked about DEVA, and it bears repeating that it was the first international consensus document on violence against women, and it recognizes violence against women as a manifestation of the historically unequal power relations between men and women. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences, is a very important mechanism that Global Rights for Women interacts with regularly. This mandate was created in 1994, and the Special Rapporteur is an expert on all issues relating to violence against women. She's elected for a 3-year term, and that can be renewed for an additional 3 years. She conducts missions to different countries. She writes thematic reports, hosts events, can call for responses on specific issues. So the work of the Special Rapporteur provides opportunities for input from individuals and organizations, something that Global Rights for Women does routinely. And we have had input and actually drafted some pieces of thematic reports of the Special Rapporteur. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is another important non-binding mechanism. It was adopted at the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, and it calls global attention to the idea that women's rights are human rights, and there's periodic reporting under that, and GRW, Global Rights for Women, drafted a report on the progress of Europe and Central Asia on behalf of the Economic Commission for Europe on the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration. UN Women, and Cheryl's already said quite a bit about it, was created in 2011 through the merger of 4 UN agencies. And most of the work of the UN on violence against women is done primarily through UN Women. And Global Rights for Women currently and throughout its existence has had numerous contracts with UN Women. Laura's going to talk about some of them. I will mention, as Cheryl did, the Essential Services Package. We drafted the coordination module and the implementation manual. And as I said, Laura will tell you more about our work on the Essential Services Package. UN Women also convenes expert group meetings. And for example, Cheryl was part of the expert group that created the Handbook on Legislation on Violence Against Women, which has served as a model for countries that are drafting legislation. Commission on Status of Women, or CSW, meets annually in New York in March over a 2-week period that includes International Women's Day, except for the last 2 years during the pandemic. And it's attended by thousands of women from around the world. It's an amazing event. And CSW has a priority theme each year, and violence was a priority theme in 2013. Global Rights for Women regularly offers sessions and sits on panels during CSW. Next, I want to talk, having talked about the regional legal frameworks, very important. So the regional frameworks have been some of the strongest, have some of the strongest language and enforcement in comparison to the international frameworks. The Convention of Belém do Pará is the treaty in the Americas. It was the first treaty to focus solely on violence against women, and it's led to important changes in domestic laws in the Americas. The Maputo Protocol is the convention of the African Union. It's not limited to violence against women, but it has some very strong language on violence. Unfortunately, only 36 of the 54 members of the African Union have ratified the protocol, and enforcement has been weak. So as a result, the African Union is currently in the process of creating a new regional treaty on violence against women. And finally, the strongest of the international conventions is the Istanbul Convention, or the full name, which is the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Abuse. It's specific. It establishes a blueprint for laws and policies to end violence against women and girls. And although it's a European treaty, it's open to ratification by any country in the world, but so far no non-European countries have ratified it. So I know I'm running out of time here. I want to talk about the gaps in the current legal framework, and there are basically, they fall into three categories: a normative gap, a geographic gap, and an enforcement gap. This is not to discount the existing legal mechanisms. They serve as an important foundation for addressing violence against women. But as we've said, violence against women continues to be the most widespread human rights violation in the world, and this is because of the major gaps. The normative gaps is that although there are many references to violence against women in global and regional treaties, they differ in scope and in nature. There are some international norms that address specific aspects of violence, such as violence in armed conflict, workplace violence, or violence as a form of discrimination. Some international treaties or norms address how particular disadvantaged groups of women experience violence, such as women with disabilities or indigenous women or older women. But no global treaty comprehensively addresses all aspects of a state's duty to protect and fulfill every woman's right to live free from violence. The geographic gap is extremely important. 75% of women in the world are not covered by a regional treaty. The women of Asia, India, Oceania, and most of the Arab world. The enforcement gap at the global level, there's a lack of resources and inefficient system have hindered monitoring bodies, contributing to high levels of impunity. States are required to submit periodic reports, as I mentioned with CEDAW, but 80% of them submit reports late. And so I'll move on from there and talk about what we see as the need, which is, of course, a binding international treaty on violence against women and girls. Global Rights for Women has taken a leadership role in what we see as the solution to filling the gaps in the international legal framework on violence against women. And we've published 2 papers on the need for an international treaty on violence against women. Time for Change was a thorough analysis of the current instruments and the gaps that we've been discussing. And Time for Action is an advocacy piece that discusses the content of a new treaty, what the content should be, and shows how other recent treaties can serve as models for adopting a strong treaty on violence against women. Finally, we work with a coalition known as the Every Woman Treaty. And this is a coalition that's been in existence for 8 years. It has 1,700 members in 128 countries. Its sole mission is to get an international treaty on violence against women adopted. It's currently involved in wide-scale diplomatic efforts to obtain support from potential lead nations to bring a resolution to the United Nations and begin the negotiation process. And we're hopeful that a treaty can be adopted in the next 3 to 5 years. Global Rights for Women has had a leadership role working with the coalition, including participating in panels and in the diplomatic meetings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. And I just want to say one quick thing about the papers here that we have pictured on our slides. For those of you who would really like to dig into understanding what's happened internationally on violence against women, legal standards and policy and law, the 2 papers that we published are really in-depth about that. And that would be a wonderful resource for you, as would the Safer Suitor report. So they're all in one package right there, if that's what you are interested in knowing. And if with doing global work, I think that's very important to have this understanding. This, like we say, this is our common language as we work with our partners across borders. It's not just a bunch of US feminists talking. These are globally adhered to standards that we can use with all of our government partners in particular, who need some convincing sometimes. So thanks so much, Helen. Why don't you go ahead, Laura?
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Helen. And thanks to everybody who's on today. I see names of people who are working on some of the projects that I'm going to be discussing today very deeply. So I'm excited to share a little bit about your contributions and hopefully motivate some of the rest of you to get involved. So again, my name is Laura Wilson, and I'm an attorney here at Global Rights for Women. I'll be talking about some of our current work as well as some of our past work to give you some examples of how we work with partners around the world as well as here in our own community. So some of our past projects and really ongoing work revolve around these topics here. So we do trainings on coordinated community response and on promising practices in legal system intervention around the world. Coordinated community response is a method of organizing across institutions in a community to create interventions that center victims' experiences. And this method of organizing was developed in Duluth, Minnesota by the Duluth, it's also known as the Duluth model, and has now been used around the world to strengthen communities' responses to domestic violence primarily, but other forms of violence against women as well. And we find it, when we do trainings on CCR, this is a way that we can really build the capacity of local communities to collaborate together to develop strong interventions. And we also, as Cheryl mentioned, are fortunate to come from a place with a really long history of organizing around violence against women, and where some very effective legal interventions have been developed that we also can, share about in our trainings around the world. We participate in UN expert group meetings. Helen mentioned this, and it's a way for us to contribute our expertise to the UN's work, their focuses, their projects around the world. And we also draft guidance and curricula for legal system professionals. Cheryl mentioned the prosecutor training curriculum that we developed last year, just really finished it up, and it will be published any day now. And that's a curriculum that will be used all over the Asia Pacific Islands region. And we've designed it so that we can do the training, or it can be used as a train the trainer curriculum. So we're really excited about the potential reach of that curriculum. Also last year, we contributed to a UN publication for police on gender responsive policing. We wrote an institutional change chapter where we really focused on coordinated community response as a method, and offered some very practical guidance on how to go about systems change to create systems, policing systems that protect the human rights of women. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk a little bit about our current work, and we have so much going on that I realized I didn't even include everything here. But the reason that I wanted to focus on these particular projects is that I think they really highlight the breadth of our work, and also help to illustrate our methods. So I'll be talking about legal commentary, the essential services package, our safety and justice reform process, some work that we're doing in Georgia, and our men's nonviolence program, Pathways to Family Peace. Next slide, please. So Helen talked a lot about the international legal framework and the gaps, and this is also true of domestic legal frameworks, that all over the world, we still see major gaps in the law in effectively addressing violence against women and girls. There are still some countries that don't have domestic violence laws, for example, or where sexual violence laws focus more on morality than they do on the protection of women's human rights. And even in countries that developed domestic violence laws fairly early on, there are needs for updates to really reflect the needs of survivors. And we find often the need to hold offenders accountable is missing as a focus from laws. So right now we're working in collaboration with UN Women with their Safe and Fair project, which focuses on protecting the rights of migrant women, to analyze laws in 3 different countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand. And what we're contributing is a comparison of those laws to the international law framework. So applying the general recommendations of CEDAW, as well as other international treaties and best practices guidance to the existing laws, and making recommendations for how to strengthen those laws. I'll give an example. We just sent in the first draft for our commentary on Vietnam. And what we found in that domestic violence law was that there are pretty strong definitions and a really strong role for community in prevention, but there was almost no role in the law for the justice system. So there's almost no access to a neutral decision maker in cases of violence against women and girls. So that's what we're really trying to contribute in our work on the legal commentary in Vietnam, is to suggest some ways that offenders may more effectively be held accountable, and that will also keep victims safer. We also tried to bring our value of centering women's experiences to this work on legal commentary. So even we're being called as experts to come in and provide a written commentary on the law, but we also know from our work around the world and in Minnesota that laws won't be effective if they're not centered around what survivors actually need, and that often legal systems professionals don't know that. And so part of what we're trying to do in our partnerships with UN Women is to also help to build the capacity of our partners to talk with women, to learn about their experiences. And so in Thailand, we're working on pulling together a group of victims We'll have a focus group discussion with them to learn about their experiences with the law, with trying to access justice in Thailand. And that will inform the recommendations that we make in our legal commentary. This work is also leading to future trainings with justice officials in this arena or in this area of the world. And we're really excited about that. It's an opportunity for us to collaborate with the local prosecutors, judges on the ground in better implementing the laws. Next slide, please.
If I could just interrupt you quickly here, Laura, I just wanted to say that that is so central to our methodology, to begin all of our projects with listening to survivors' voices and what they experienced. If there was any intervention at all, how did it affect them? And like Laura said, what did they need? And this was the basis actually of creating that power and control wheel. I'm not sure I said that those results of that, what you see on that wheel is the results of hundreds of interviews with victims of violence, talking about what their experience was, how they were controlled through these various means that are depicted in the, and that gave us the information that we needed here in the 80s in many parts of the country. That was the foundation upon which our anti-violence movement grew.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, and I neglected to mention that consultants, volunteer and expert consultants often help us with our legal commentaries. So Lori Flohag, who's an attorney and former prosecutor and former tribal court judge, just helped us with drafting the commentary in Vietnam. And we really love to have legal professionals help us with that work. Cheryl talked a little bit and Helen both about the essential services package. So I won't go too much into detail about that, but it is a set of standards to remind you that the UN developed that countries should be providing for survivors of violence in the justice and policing sector, the health sector, and the social services sector. And then there's also a module that GRW contributed to on coordination. And so we're now using that essential services package in quite a bit of our work, but specifically on an analysis of services being provided in Haiti. And also we are doing an analysis of how those essential services have been adapted during COVID-19. So these are really exciting projects that we're working with UN Women on. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about safety and justice reform, and I will talk about a project where we're using this methodology, but first I want to give a little bit of background on what this is. Safety and justice reform is a process that comes from a sociological approach called institutional ethnography. And what we do in safety and justice reform is not just to look at what an institution or system produces, but we seek to discover the gaps between what the system produces and what victims need. The focus is not on the performance of individual practitioners, but instead on how jobs are organized within an institution to achieve victim safety and offender accountability. So I'll give an example. Say that Helen and Cheryl are both police officers within the same police station. And Cheryl is really passionate about domestic violence, and it's the reason that she became a police officer, whereas Helen really prefers property crimes and feels very uncomfortable responding to domestic violence. Of course, this is not true. They're both very passionate and would be the stars of the station. But just as an example, you can provide the same trainings to both of them over and over again, and that's not going to change Helen's level of passion for property crimes over domestic violence. And so what we need to do, what we've learned, is that we need to look at all of the different ways that institutions organize their workers and look for where is the gap and how can we better organize the job so that every police officer or every person within whatever institution it is providing more of the level of service that Cheryl is, right? That someone that's really passionate about the job is. So we look at all of these different 8 methods that organizations use to organize their workers. And an example would be that if we find that the police really aren't, their police report form really isn't designed to ask any questions about the context of the abuse or the risk that a victim faces, then we might help that community to develop a risk assessment tool, a policy to implement the tool, policy that guides police officers on how to ask the risk assessment questions, and a system of accountability. So something that happens when police officers don't do the risk assessment. So that's just an example to show how we might use the safety and justice reform method. Next slide, please. So we're currently using this methodology in several different communities, but I'll talk about our own. In 2018, we contributed to a study on the domestic violence response by the Minneapolis Police Department, which is where our office is located. And that study found that there was an alarmingly low rate of report writing and arrests in Minneapolis compared to national standards, and that there was a lack of accountability for officers to follow the existing policy. So there was a policy in place, but if officers didn't follow it, there really wasn't anything that would happen or anything that would encourage them to do that. And so we were asked to help form a domestic violence working group within the city of Minneapolis. So we formed that group, and it consists of police officers, city attorney representatives, Hennepin County Attorney's Office, probation, advocates from the domestic violence community, and the Office of Police Conduct Review, as well as a judge who has done a lot of training with us, Judge Liz Cutter. And we're really excited about this group. They're a very passionate group of people who is working with us to implement the safety and justice reform process and come up with some ways that we can improve the domestic violence response. So we're using all of these methods I've listed here. I know I don't have much time, so I won't go too into depth, but it really is kind of a deep analysis using multiple different mechanisms to understand what's happening currently, what's the gap between what victims need from the police and what they're providing, and how can we change that? Can you go to the next slide, please? And I think this is the last project I'll be talking about. Or no, two more. So really quick, in 2016 to 2017, we used the safety and justice reform process in the country of Georgia to help develop a risk assessment tools for police to use. And this year we've been invited to come back to analyze how that implementation has gone. So we'll again be doing lots of interviews, observation, focus groups with victims to understand how the risk assessment tool is being used and whether any changes are needed. We'll also be doing an evaluation of the state-run shelters in Georgia for victims of domestic violence. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a picture of the group that helped to develop the risk assessment tool. Next picture, or next slide. And then the last program I'll talk about is Pathways to Family Peace. Our international training director, Melissa Skaya, for many, many years, about 20 years, has been facilitating batters intervention programs for men who are domestic violence offenders. And most of these men are court ordered to participate in a group. And a couple of years ago started Pathways to Family Peace together with another trainer, John, who may be on the call today, but is still a facilitator with GRW. And they started this program to offer batters intervention programming by video conference, which was very innovative at the time. This was pre-COVID. And they also hired a researcher to track how to study how this worked via video conference and what were the safety issues and what made it effective, so that they could really improve the program and share with the rest of the community how this program can be done. And so this year, GRW has taken on Pathways as an official GRW program, and we're offering 3 programs a week via video conference. And Melissa is also doing national and international training on offering BIP programs virtually. We also allow observation of our BIP sessions. So many of our supporters have signed up to observe the men's group to really understand more about domestic violence, about the causes of domestic violence, about the thinking that contributes to domestic violence, and how we try to change that thinking, how we try to address male entitlement, and create the ability for men to change. So you're invited to sign up for one of those sessions if you'd like to observe, and Pat put the link in the chat for where you can sign up. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I think I'll turn it back to Cheryl to open up for some questions.
Yes, so we would love to have your questions, comments, input. No question is out of bounds. And we would love to engage in discussion with you. Let's see here. What do we have? Well, people are, or Pat, maybe you can tell me, are we getting some questions in the chat? Yes.
So far, we don't have any questions in the chat. I thought I would let people know that I put the resources for a lot of the materials in the chat again, and added the email for Pathways observation if people are interested in signing up to attend a session as an observer. While we're waiting for questions, I also thought I would mention one of the links in the chat is to Global Rights for Women's fall event, Global Rights for Women Now, and that's happening September 16th, and we would love to see you there virtually. We have a great lineup of human rights activists who are going to speak. Cheryl will also be speaking. Zainab Salbi and Kamala Basin, who are just really wonderful, so you won't want to miss that. The second thing I also included in the chat regarding Global Rights for Women is our Get Involved tab on the website. So if after attending this webinar you have questions or want to reach out and potentially find out more about the projects that we're doing and how you might be involved, you can do it there as well. So
Thank you, Pat.
yeah.
There's a couple other on our how you can help slide, which I think is the next slide. Nazifa, thanks so much for your support on this too. So Pat mentioned a couple of these. You know, I always say when people ask, as they often do, what can I do? How can I help? And please just be aware that there are leaders now everywhere, everywhere we have traveled, and that are working on women's human right to be free from violence. And this is just a resource for you to support these people at the local level, maybe the state level, the national level, international level. These particularly those, I think about a group in California right now who is working to close the loophole in their sexual assault statute for marital rape. They need people who are knowledgeable, who are passionate, will call, will lobby, will support their efforts to change that. And that's really true wherever we go. There are advocates. Oftentimes in some countries, they're the women and men who are serving the victims of violence, and they know so clearly, as most don't, what the needs are of women, and they're proposing new laws and policies and strategies. So get to know them, support them. As far as our work with Global Rights for Women there in that fourth bullet point, let us know your expertise. Of course, we love volunteers. We have had volunteers who are judges, we've had volunteers who are prosecutors, legal advocates. There's consulting opportunities. When we have finances to do that through our contracts, we can hire consultants who have specific expertise in an area where an international partner might need it. As I said before, we often take prosecutors, judges, police, probation officers with us. We'll be doing that when we travel to Georgia in August. We will have a prosecutor with us. And now I'm getting a message that there are lots of questions. So
Yeah. Well, Here's a really fantastic question. What's your experience with how aware local women's groups, human rights groups are about the legal frameworks that do exist? Do they know about them and simply experience the gaps, or do they not know? How aware are local governments? What trends do you notice about those government personnel that are eager to take this up and those that don't or can't?
Oh, that is a great question. Let me take a, or Helen or Laura, do you want to, should I start off here and then you guys jump in?
I can start if you want.
Please, that'd be great.
In my experience, the women's groups, the NGOs that we work with nationally are extremely knowledgeable about the existing legal frameworks, and often what I've seen most often is that these groups work both as direct service providers and doing policy advocacy work. And so they're really the ones who are aware of what changes are needed in the law. They often know who the government officials are, the policymakers are, who are most likely to be sympathetic. They have so much knowledge and are so savvy about this. And so what we have to offer is our expertise in other locations, and the fact that we come in as international experts. Sometimes a government is more willing to listen to an international expert than they are someone from a local organization, but they are extremely knowledgeable, extremely savvy.
I would just add, Helen, too, much more so than most of us are in the US. I mean, because we study this and we, as I say, use that as our common language, but you know, the idea of women's human right to be free from violence is not something that's as kind of part of the narrative in the US as it is when we're traveling locally. And these human rights instruments, like the Istanbul Convention is a powerful one that has such influence on governments. So the advocates know that using that language and the directives from an instrument like that will have power with their government in a way that international or regional law hasn't had so much in the United States. And we could talk about that forever, but our partners are very, very knowledgeable and use these instruments to really encourage and push their governments to join the world in ending violence against women here, and here's some practical ways to do it.
So we have another set of questions that are related. How does global rights for women intersect with the larger human rights community, immigrant rights, BIPOC rights, LGBT rights, etc.? And please talk about the intersection of culture and cultural norms and the laws that protect women.
Great question. Laura, do you want to start on that one, or would you like me to? I know you have many things.
Sure, yeah, I can start. I mean, I think that one thing that we know is that around the world, in every community, systems are set up, to serve the people with most power. We know that. And so we know that if we create, together with people on the ground, if we're aiming to create interventions that respond to the needs of people who are being marginalized, that those interventions are going to actually serve everyone better, rather than if we look at the people who are, not marginalized, who have most access to justice, right? We need to look at who has the least access to justice. How do we make sure that they have access? And that's really going to create better access for everyone. So that is a focus of ours. And for example, when we go and do focus groups, we try to talk with women who do have the least access, We also recognize, for example, our work in the Asia Pacific Islands region right now is focused on how do we create better domestic violence laws, but also how do we make sure that migrant women are protected within those laws, that there are some specific measures that address the very different experiences that migrant women have from women who are citizens of a country. So there's intersection in all of our work, and what we try to do is to really listen to our partners to make sure that that we have the right partners and that we're listening to their local expertise, because they're the people who can really help us to make sure that we're taking an intersectional approach.
Well, that's a great segue to another question about listening to survivors. So when listening to survivors, is there a specific shared feeling or experience that you seem to notice, or what stands out to you?
I'll just start by saying, while you guys think about the response to that, I think that the power and control wheel is just a really, not the right word is surprising, but it has amazing resonance everywhere we go. So when we talk about, what's a common experience, when you look at those different sectors around the circle, everywhere we go, women survivors and those who serve them talk about those tools, or how those tools are being used to subjugate and control and intimidate and silence and isolate women and girls. And then, as I said before, punctuated by physical violence to ensure that power and control. But I think, when we talk about, and there's another question I see in the chat about culture, I think, there are lots of different ways to think about culture, of course. Again, another hours long conversation. What is culture? What we have found is that everywhere in the world, there are women demanding, not just asking anymore, demanding their human right to be free from violence. So I see that as defining a culture as much as perhaps, let's give the example of Erdogan in Turkey, who just withdrew from the powerful Istanbul Convention, withdrew Turkey from that convention because of his lack of commitment to ending violence against women. So, who defines the culture there? Now, I'll say, we always in our trainings have resistance to the premise that we operate on, that women are fully human and that women have the human right, therefore, to be free from violence. We encounter that everywhere we go. Sometimes it's articulated more harshly than others, but it's always in the room. That pervades our world still. And it's not limited to one region or another. It's where there are laws, we do know that the situation for women is better. So the laws, as we believe and have seen in our work, do provide the bedrock for raising the issue, creating the space for a discussion about women as being fully human with a human right to be free from violence. At a minimum, they do that. So thank you for that question.
There's another question. Do you anticipate that there will be another UN conference on women's issues like the Beijing conference?
Helen, what do you think?
I know that there's been a lot of discussion, and especially at the 25th anniversary of Beijing, there was a lot of discussion about having another conference. But I think I think the reason that one hasn't happened, and Cheryl and Laura, you may have other thoughts about this, is that the general feeling is that the resources to put on a big conference like that can be better used in other ways. And so there just hasn't been the there hasn't been a compelling enough reason for another world conference like the Beijing conference.
There have been some not really substitutes, but for example, the global network of women's shelters does a conference every 4 years, and that draws a lot of activists and leaders from around the world that are committed to ending violence against women. Even though it really is focused on shelters, there's a lot of other issues that come up. And I think that probably is the trend. Maybe there'll be a conference on legal reform.
Well, we have a great question that I think really sums up so much of what this work is about. And the question is specifically, how do we change hearts and minds to support and enact the laws to protect women and girls? Who wants to take that nice big one?
Laura, you want to tackle it?
I was going to ask you, Cheryl, because I'm looking for the correct link for the MPD study. So I'm going to find it wrong. So why don't you take that and I'll try to find the link.
Yeah, so I'll start out, and if you want to jump in here. Yeah, it's a great question to kind of, we have a few more minutes, so we don't maybe have to end with this exact one, but it's essential to change hearts and minds. As I was saying before, there are still many people in the world who do not believe in women's human right to be free from violence, or that women are fully human. That is a reality in our world, and how we change the hearts and minds by in a number of ways. When we talk about legal and systemic change at Global Rights for Women, that's our laser focus. We know that that's not the only thing that has to be done to towards transformational thinking. There needs to be focus on girls' education. There needs to be focus on women's reproductive health and rights. There needs to be focus on, women journalists are being targeted for exposing human rights violation. Women in government have been targeted as victims of violence and threats. So there are just so many different ways to come at this issue, to do this kind of just really sea change, transformational thinking about women and girls. I think the more we do what we are doing, and that's focused not only on the really critically needed services like shelters and hotlines and legal representation in the courts, but systemic changes. And this is the beauty of a law, like regional law, like the Istanbul Convention. I mean, that's 40 countries or more, 47 or something, I can't remember the exact number, that are members of the Council of Europe. And this is their consensus document about what government needs to do. And for many, if not most of the countries in that region, to prioritize, a mandatory arrest or a evidence-based prosecution, it transforms and get a conviction for a sexual assault that the community sees is a way of transformational thinking. And okay, talk too long. Laura, Helen, do you have anything else to add?
I think you said it.
Okay. Well, I think in our trainings too, what Laura said, it's so important to do that institutional when you've got a Cheryl police officer and a Helen police officer. You do both the kind of institutional thinking about the processes, you raise the capacity to write an effective risk assessment. You also provide space. In every one of our trainings, we do this for at least a day, to dig into people's thinking about the subjugation of women through violence. And without exception, minds, when we do this well, and we select our trainers who can do this well, that we see that happen. We see that happen when that space is provided. So often it just never has been before.
Well, I'd like to thank you for that. And also share, I put in the chat, we have a conversation series called Valiant Voices, where we take on a lot of the topics around the work that we do and have a conversation about just that thing. You know, how do we change hearts and minds? How do we share information so people can go forward and feel educated? So I have a comment in the chat. Thank you for this webinar. This is really great what you are doing. I am the legal counsel from the company Avon Beauty Products Company in the Russian office, and we have a special program to support women against domestic violence. So thank you. The information was very useful.
Excellent example of something you can do in your private company that you might be associated with. Lobby for this kind of activity. I know we have encountered Avon and its work all over the world, where we've seen some of these private companies just awareness campaigns, donations to the local shelter. I can't, of course, I'm not going to think of other companies off the top of my head, but this is something private companies can do too, and law firms and
yeah, well, and our partnership with Global Women Fresh, which is an organization that works with women in the fresh foods industry, and is wanting to do some work on improving employer policies for people who may be survivors of domestic violence. So there's so many different ways.
And our fabulous partnership with Baker McKenzie, this largest international law firm in the world, who has taken on this amazing project to have their volunteer lawyers do the pro bono work of assisting with the analyzing of laws and the legal system's response to violence against women. That's an amazing thing. A company like that with so many resources and people that can begin to have just a ripple effect throughout the world like that. They have offices, like I say, all over the world in many, many countries. So that has a powerful potential to change hearts and minds.
We've gotten through our questions that we had in the chat, unless there's more coming. If any of you all here on our excellent panel today have final comments, now would be great to hear from you.
Helen, anything from you?
Sorry, I had to unmute. As someone who has been involved with global rights for women from the beginning, and who is now mostly retired, but still doing work for global rights for women, I just can't say enough about how important this organization is, what an amazing job it does in creating those relationships around the world, learning what's needed, and helping the people who are on the ground doing the work make the changes that they need.
Thank you, Helen. And for all your work on this new treaty. That's going to be a global game changer when it happens.
We certainly hope so.
Laura, any final comments from you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a final word of thanks to all the volunteers and consultants who are on the webinar today. We absolutely could not do all of this work without you. We're a very small staff, and we're so lucky to be connected to so many talented, smart people with so much depth of experience, from our college and law student interns all the way to our judges and prosecutors and advocates, and everyone who contributes their expertise. So we're just really appreciative.
Yes, I would echo that as we close out here. Thank you for that, Laura, and for your presentation. And thank you, Helen. And thank you all so very much for your interest in our work. And please stay connected. Like I said in the beginning, we just are stronger when we work together. So huge thanks to you all, and take care.